We're going to stream us out on Facebook. And yeah, well, that's our mic. That's your mic too, by the way. We need to make sure that if you say something, and we do want everybody to be heard. By the way, some of the people out there, we're not hearing you as well. So make sure you speak into your computers and make sure we can hear. Thank you, Mary. We're going to make sure everybody can hear everybody. Here we are on Facebook. We're ready to go. Last week we had a chance to read David's becoming king story. Well, we haven't finished it, but we started it. And what we saw was that David became king in Hebron, and when he was king, there was another king, Saul's son. So there was two kings for a while. There was, David seems to have kind of considered himself king when Saul was alive. And he also seems to very much consider himself king when Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, is king. So we don't talk about Ishbosheth. We even call him by his real name, which was Ishbal. He's called the son of shame. And so we really don't even know we don't even know him by his real name, but he never goes down as one of the kings of Israel. But he was a king of Israel for a couple of years. And what the final, his final break, or his final, what really brings him down, whatever you want to call his demise, I guess, is not based on his inability to rule or his inability to have a group of followers. He had those. What really brought him down was the fact that Abner, his father's general, had a woman named Ritzpah, who we read about, who is Saul's concubine, and Abner was sleeping with her, had taken her after Saul died. And Ishbosheth found that to be unacceptable. And Abner, who was really the power behind the throne, said, if that's the way you're going to be, you won't be king anymore, and you won't be alive anymore. And that's exactly what happened. Saul's son Ishbosheth dies. And it seems again that Abner was, that was the breaking point for Abner. He already kind of respected David. Abner,
he doesn't defend. He doesn't stick with the guy who gets mad at him.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but it comes down to a woman. And interestingly, of course, there's also another woman in play, which is Michal. Because when Abner makes an overture to David and says, hey, I'm going to make you king, David says, fine, but you better come here with Michal. You better bring my wife, Saul's daughter, back to me. And what was interesting, of course, is that David didn't rely on Abner. David also sent messengers to Ishbosheth, who was essentially Michal's half brother. David basically told him, you better bring me Michal. And Ishbosheth actually did it. So as much as, maybe he was trying to buy some time, right? Ishbosheth was trying to stay in power by maybe hoping that David would just be king of Judah and leave him alone. If he gave Michal, he does it. But of course, that's not what happens. Ishbosheth dies, and it doesn't really say how he died. It just doesn't really say. And here's what happened. Abner basically threatens him. And what does it say? It says that that was the story of Abner killing Joab's brother, which is another part of this story. But what really happens, and all it says is when Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost heart, and all Israel was alarmed. Well, that's all we read so far, actually. We haven't gotten to his death yet. I don't think so. I don't think we got to it. We got to Abner's death. Yeah. So Abner died because Yoav stabbed him, right? So let's talk about that just to remind people, because we definitely read that. Abner had killed in one of the battles for control, and we just read about it, a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Abner killed Yoav's brother Asahel. He stabbed him as he was chasing after him, and Abner warned him and said, "You better turn back." And he didn't listen, and Abner killed him. Yoav is sent by David to go negotiate terms with Abner. We read about this last week, and Abner was negotiating with Yoav, and Yoav just stabbed him. And it says Yoav killed, and his brother Abishai killed Abner because he had killed their brother during Gibeon, the Battle of Gibeon. So that was Yoav, David's general. So Abner is Saul's general. Yoav is David's general. They're kind of paired off as enemies and as rivals, and they definitely have a rivalry. Yoav kills Abner, and David then tells Yoav and all the troops to mourn for Abner, rend their clothes, lament for Abner, who he says was a hero. And David himself walks behind his coffin as they bury him. And needless to say, this does not make Yoav very happy, because the king intones this dirge over Abner. Should Abner have died the death of a churl, which is, again, should he have, like a fool? Should he have died like a Naval, a fool, or oaf, not a good person. And all the troops came to urge David to eat something while it was still day, but David swore, "I will not eat." So he fasts for his rival, but someone he respects. And all the troops took note of it and approved, just as all the troops approved of everything else the king did. That day, all the troops and all Israel knew that it was not by the king's will that Abner, the son of Ner, was killed. And so it's very important for everybody to know that David had nothing to do with Abner's murder. He was assassinated, and David did not want to be responsible for it. He makes sure that everybody knows it, that the Bible says it. The king said to his soldiers, "You know that a great man has died this day. And today I'm weak. Even though I anointed king, I'm the king, right? I'm the Messiah. Those men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too savage for me. May the Lord requite the wicked for their wickedness." And so he essentially curses Yoav and the other brother Abishai and says, "These guys are way too much." And that's kind of where we left off. I think we read. No, I think we read right to about here. Yeah. We actually read. This is where we left off with Ishbosheth, which again, we just read it. We didn't kind of get into it, but so we're on 2 Samuel chapter 4. And that's where we're going to pick up. David is establishing himself as king. So we're going to see what he does. Who else has to die? Who else is going to...
How old is David?
He's in his 40s at this point. He's in his 40s. So he's kind of at the height of his physical powers, or maybe his good time to be king. But let's read what happens. We're not done with a couple things that we read about. That's why I wanted to recap a little bit, because we're not done with Michal. We're going to see her this week. We're not done with Saul's family. Bless you. And everybody is caught up. Everybody knows the characters. You got Saul's dead. Bless you. Most of his family, his sons are dead. His daughter Michal is still alive. He has a son Ishbosheth, who right now is still alive. Let's read what happens with Saul's family, the rest of Saul's family. And remember, we read that very weird story about how Saul's body had to be rescued by the people of Yabesh Gilead because the body was taken by the Philistines and humiliated, and they hung it up. And so that was all part of the story. And David actually, congratulated and thanked the people of Yabesh Gilead for bringing Saul's body back. But a lot of violence. We're not done. The violence is not done yet. So Rosemary, here in the house, would you like to continue reading? So you can either read from there, you have your book, whatever.
What page are we on?
We're on chapter, good question. Second, there you go.
651.
Thank you,
Thank
Marcia. Thank you. So for those following at home on your books too, we're at chapter 4 of the second book of Samuel. And again, there was no separation originally in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, between the two books. And we actually read 2 weeks ago, we read right from the end of the first section of Samuel into the second. And that's where we are, beginning of this section. This section, and the reason why they broke it, why the Christian scholars broke it, is the death of Saul. Saul dies at the end of the first book, and now we're dealing with the fallout. You could also make the argument it's a good place to break it once King David. You could also break it about here, but we're not here, but the next chapter. All right, Rosemary, take it away.
When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost heart, and all Israel was alarmed. The son of Saul had 2 company commanders, one named Baanah and the other Rachav, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, Benjaminites, since Beeroth too was considered part of Benjamin. The Beerothites had fled to Gittaim, where they have sojourned to this day. So
this is a little explanation for how a part of the tribe of Benjamin is living, in a different area than they originally lived. Why? Because they fled during Saul's family's fall from grace, if you will.
Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son whose feet were crippled. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse picked him up and fled. But as she was fleeing in haste, he fell and was lamed. His name was Mephibosheth. Okay,
so let's just comment about that. If you look at the note, the original form of his name was Meribal. That's in the book of Chronicles. So when we come to the book of Chronicles, which is a retelling of the history, it actually tells us that his name was Meribal, which is similar to what they did with Ishbal's name, and they turned it to Ishbal. So they took the name Baal, took it out, and put in the name Shane. So his name is not quite the same as Meribal. His name is actually, further obscured. But again, maybe it was a nickname. We don't know. But what's really interesting about this guy, this young guy, is that he's crippled. That's the word that they used. It's not a politically correct word, but he is differently abled. And the word that they use here is essentially that his feet were crushed. His feet were couldn't use his feet. His legs. No, his you read it. That's why it happened. That's why. But the Bible seems to be very clear that David had nothing to do with it. There's a reason for that. Mephibosheth could have a claim to be king. But having this different ability renders him completely incapable of ever being king. And so David's scribes, or David's side, definitely wants to make it clear that David had nothing to do with this. It's the only reason why that's there. There would never be a description of how and why somebody. And first of all, we very rarely, I mean, this is one of the few places in the whole Bible where we ever hear about somebody not being, not being able to use certain limbs. We have to assume it, or there's probably other people that happened to. In the whole Bible, this is the only person, not the only person, but one of the few people that we hear has some type of physical, whatever you want to call it. Yes. I mean, it seems a little strange. And again, there's a reason for it, which is that this is the guy who could have been a rival to King David. And what's important about this is that this is his friend Jonathan's son. And so we read about how much he loves Jonathan. This is his friend Jonathan's son. And so he has an interesting role to play in the rest of the story, because on one hand, he's part of Saul's family. He's part of that dynasty, a dynasty that never really gets off the ground. But he's also a potential rival. And he's also, though, the son of David's dear friend. So all of these things go into this character. He's an interesting guy. He's a guy that we would like to have heard more about, because he's in some way a survivor. He's a survivor of the purge of Saul's family. There was a purge, and he survived it. He survived it because maybe he could never be king. He's an interesting guy, because he's one of these guys that you go, how did he survive? What happened to him? And these are interesting stories. These are stories of, when they happen in history, you're like, oh my gosh, I mean, somebody actually, that really happened, that, and you almost say, that person is we call them survivors, but they're also like, they're like a remnant, and you say, oh, this is, like there was the story of the last Native American that lived in Los Angeles, right? I think they even made a movie about the guy. Can't remember, but he was like one of the last full-blooded, Native American tribes person, people, lived about 100 years ago. Look, the Last Emperor, the story of Henry Pouilly that Bertolucci turned into a movie, was an Oscar, winning movie, was about the last Manchurian emperor who, ended up dying as a poor guy in communist China, but he survived. I mean, no one knew how he could have survived, but some of these people survived. I mean, there's people who survived Stalin's purges and somehow, made it through. And then there's obviously the stories of the Holocaust where, somebody was the only person in their entire family that survived. This guy, Mephibosheth, is one of these survivors that would be interesting to have had his story. What was the vantage point? What was the perspective of King David from where he was, from his family's downfall, Abner's downfall?
Because David also promised Jonathan that he'd take care of his kids.
Yeah. And this is the guy who
took care of them all right.
well, let's look at Mephibosheth. So all right.
Rechav and Baanah, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, started out, and they reached the home of Ishbosheth at the heat of the day when he was taking his midday rest. So they went inside the house as though fetching wheat and struck him in the belly. Rechav and his brother Baanah slipped by and entered the house while he was asleep on his bed in his bedchamber, and they stabbed him to death. They cut off his head and took his head and made their way all night through the Arabah.
So that's how the king Ishbal died. Watch what happens when they come to King David.
They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David in Hebron. Here, they said to the king, is the head of your enemy, Ishbosheth, a son of Saul, who sought your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king upon Saul and his offspring. But David answered Rechav and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, and said to them, as the Lord lives, who has rescued me from every trouble, the man who told me in Ziklag that Saul was dead thought he was bringing good news, but instead of rewarding him for the news, I seized and killed him. How much more then, when wicked men have killed a blameless man in bed in his own house? I will certainly avenge his blood on you, and I will rid the earth of you.
So these guys think they're doing King David a favor. They bring this head of Ishbosheth as proof that they killed him, and they assume they're about to be rewarded. And David says, I'm going to do to you the same thing I did to the guy who said he killed King Saul. We're not really sure he killed King Saul, but he says he did, and he said he did, whatever.
David gave orders to the young men who killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung them up by the pool in Hebron. And they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner at Hebron.
So that's what David does with Ishbosheth. Now, on one hand, he seems to be, sending a message to that it's not okay to kill a guy who's called the king of Israel. Even if it's his enemy, he doesn't want any of these kings to be killed because, of course, he could be killed too. If you can kill a king of Israel, why not him, right? So he sends a message. It's not okay to kill a king of Israel, even my rival. So it's
Also, the people that supported Ishbosheth are a little more likely to go, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, he never ordered it. This wasn't something that David actually asked for, which, of course, is also very politically convenient that Ishbosheth is now dead, because it saves him a lot of effort and a lot of whatever to have done this. But the Bible seems to be very clear that David had nothing to do with Ishbosheth's murder. What's interesting, though, is that Ishbosheth is not given a royal burial. He's buried with Abner, who David gave a lot of honors to, but he didn't create a special grave for Ishbosheth. He doesn't bury him with Saul, his father.
Is that because he was named? And it would have been.
Who knows? What do you mean that Saul's body was named?
No,
So,
that Ishbosheth's body was.
oh, well, so was Saul's. I mean, what do you like? What's the argument here? He should have been buried in a royal tomb, assumedly wherever Saul was buried, he should have been buried there too. He's not. He's buried with Abner, which again, you can make the argument Abner was given, high value burial, whatever. It wasn't like Abner didn't, but let's be frank about it. We don't even know what happened to the rest of Ishbosheth. Assume his body got buried somewhere else. It's only his head. That's what it said. That's it. So it's all they had. That's what it said. That's what it said. It took his head and they buried it. So they don't even have a full body. So you can make that argument that like, what do we do with a head? So they buried it, but they buried it with Abner, which is almost like saying, well, Abner was really the important one. I'm not, you could read it another way, but it seems like a simple way of saying that Abner was the important one here from the Saul. No, we don't know. We don't know where they are. So we don't know where they are. And interestingly, it is important to mention that it is Hebron, right? This is David's town. This is not in Benjamin. This is not where Abner lived. This is not where Saul lived. This is not in Gibeah. This is not where Ishbosheth lived. He gets buried in Hebron, which is almost like saying we're taking care of it now. We took care of it. We're not sending his head back to Benjamin for you guys to bury. We're taking care of it, which is what they did with Abner. They basically gave Abner a royal burial or the equivalent of a royal burial in their hometown. And we don't know where, we know where David was buried. We don't know where David was buried. We don't know the exact place where David was buried, but we know where he was buried. We know that by the time David and Solomon are kings, that they get buried in Jerusalem. We don't know where they're buried. We don't know the exact location of these burial sites. We know the general vicinity where the kings of Judah were buried. We don't know where they're buried, and we don't know where Saul was buried, and we don't know where Abner and Ishbosheth are buried. But Hebron is where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, and Leah, and Rebecca are buried, not Rachel. She's buried somewhere else in Bethlehem. But Hebron was a legitimate place to be buried. It just wasn't in Gibeah. It wasn't in Abner's hometown. It wasn't in Ishbosheth's hometown. So he's not buried in the royal area of his family, or where his family came from, or whatever you want to call it. The family tomb. He wasn't buried there.
Is it not, was it not saved through history so that it didn't become a shrine?
No, David's tomb. There was a time when people knew where David's tomb was. We know it. People talked about it. We just don't know where it is now. We have a place that is called Absalom's tomb that you can go visit. We're not 100% sure that Absalom is buried there, but that's what it's called. So we know the general vicinity where David and his family are buried, or some of his family are buried. But yeah, I mean, those tombs, there was a time when people went to those tombs and said prayers there or did something there, but knew where it was. And they knew where it was pretty late. I mean, it wasn't like it was probably probably at the end of the first temple period, people still were regularly going to that grave area. But again, who knows how much David and the kings were loved by then either. I mean, not so much David, but the later Judean kings. Anyways, these guys are, this is kind of who's left, Mephibosheth. So here's what happens now with this is chapter 5. Now David, all his rivals are essentially gone or incapable of being king. So here's what happens.
All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. Long before now, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led Israel in war. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel. You shall be ruler of Israel."
Wow. So now the rest of the tribes of Israel, the northern tribes, have come to David at Hebron, where he's king, and they say to him, we're all one people. And even before Saul died, you were the one who led the people in battle. We knew you were important. We respected you then. And we know that God said that you were going to be the king. What's interesting about this phrase here too is that they say to him that God had said to David, you shall be my shepherd. That David is called a shepherd. He's called ruler too. It says you'll rule the people. You'll be the Nagid, which is a ruler, but also a leader, I would say. I would have translated that as leader. Mary, does it say ruler? Yeah. I don't like ruler. Ruler implies even a level of I wouldn't say respect, but it's a recognition here that they're basically saying, David, you're in charge, but you're in charge as a shepherd, right? As a captain, as a head, more as a captain, but the head of a team.
Be careful how you use that word head.
He's the team captain. That's what you'd call, like in Hebrew, modern day Hebrew today, the Nagid is the leader. It's the person who's the leader, but not necessarily a ruler, not necessarily a king. So the recognition of him is that he's the shepherd, God's shepherd, and God's team captain, the squad leader, if you will. But that's a different idea than a king. Not that, again, the king wouldn't be doing that, but there is this understanding that David's role and God's role in God's desire for that ruler, for that king to be more of a shepherd or a captain rather than a king. And so this is actually kind of a recognition of what they wanted, maybe what God wanted, which is is that the shepherd isn't necessarily even the owner, right? You don't own these people. You're their leader. You're responsible for them, but you're not their ruler. I don't love the translation ruler here, but I also think it's important that they recognize that. And maybe that's the recognition of what a leader should be, which is not that they rule over people, but that they lead them and that they shepherd them, but not that they rule over them. And that's not the mode maybe that the Bible desires for it. And it's not, by the way, for us as Americans, that's the kind of the desire that we have. I mean, our leaders, our forefathers in this country didn't want there to be a king. They didn't want somebody to be a ruler over the people. They wanted someone who'd be a shepherd or a leader, but not a ruler. So that is, I think, a fairly significant difference in the way this is presented to them. Because remember, a shepherd doesn't necessarily own the flock. Shepherd is sometimes just working for the owner of the flock. I mean, and again, it's an important role. We say, David said, the Lord is my shepherd. So even the shepherd has a boss, but the shepherd is also, it's definitely more of a caretaker. Yeah. And care, and literally giving care, protecting rather than ruling. So here's what they said, or what they did. Oh, he's not 40, he's 30, sorry.
All the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a pact with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years.
Yeah, so he wasn't 40, he was 30, but he reigned for 40 years. So that's not.
He became king, not when he was anointed king.
Yeah, he was anointed king many years before that, right? But so as a teenager, but he's now king at 30, and he reigns for 40 years, which means that he didn't have a super long lifespan. I mean, you do the math, it's a normal lifespan, but it's not like it's a long reign, but it's not a super long lifespan, right? So he dies at around 70. There's an interesting midrash that that's the midrash, right? So Ronnie just shared it. So 70 years is like exactly how long a lifespan is supposed to be. It actually says in Psalms, what's the man's life? 70 years. So there's a midrash that because Adam lives, I didn't want to say anything, but that's why we have a tradition of having a second bar mitzvah at 83. So you're only 8 years away from your second bar mitzvah. When you're 83, you get to have a second bar mitzvah because you've got 13 bonus years after your 70th. So at 83, you get your second bar mitzvah because 70. So the midrash on Adam was that Adam lives weirdly to 930 years, which is weird because like 930 years, it's like, that's almost 1,000 years. It's exactly 70 years less, right? So there's a missing life, right? There's like one lifespan. And so, and by the way, Adam's descendant, Methuselah, right? Who's the 8th generation after David, he lives 969 years. So David actually has a descendant that lives longer than him. So it's possible to live. Adam has a descendant, but Adam and David are linked by this interesting midrash, which is that when Adam gets to see his descendants, all his descendants, he has the ability to see this guy, David, who would have died at childbirth. But he sees what David can do if he's made king, and God gives him the opportunity to give part of his life, his lifespan, to King David. So he transfers over his 70 years and says, let David live, because he was not supposed to survive as a child. And he says, let that guy live, because he's going to live a remarkable 70 years. He's going to have a remarkable life. Worked out. The midrash, the midrash, the math works out, but the point of the story is that Adam essentially made sure that David could live. The ancestor for all humans wanted to make sure that this human in particular could live. It's a nice midrash. Yeah, yeah. If he hadn't been for this transfer of 70 years. So it's a nice midrash. I mean, somebody came up with this, this beautiful connection between David's lifespan and Adam's life, and again, having the ability to do that, right? But it's a great midrash. So I was just about to tell, and thankfully, Ronnie knew that midrash. I'm glad that somebody knew that midrash, because it's one of my favorite midrashim about King David's life and about how special he was, that Adam himself made sure that this guy could be born. All right, but he doesn't have a super long life, and we will get to David's last days. David, there's no person, and we said this at the beginning, there's no person in the Bible that we get more of their life detailed than David.
Did David understand? This goes back to when he was out with the sheep, right? Or the crop, or whatever he was doing, right? And then they go get him and bring him back and say, this goes back to that far back, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's when we first see David is as a shepherd when his brothers are being evaluated, and they say, what about, are there any more? We got David. So yes, we know about David from his childhood. The only other person that we really get anywhere close to this detail is Jacob. Jacob we see from his birth all the way to his death, but we don't get as much detail. We don't get as many conversations. Jacob, interestingly, doesn't say that much. David says a lot. David has a lot of conversations. A lot of them are preserved. Seems almost verbatim, or if not verbatim, then someone wanted us to think that he said those things like, you think you're going to live by telling me this information? I'm going to kill you just like I killed you. I mean, those kind of levels of conversations are also there, not just you're going to die. The level of conversation is there. So,
Just real quickly,
yep.
the first who they beheaded
Yeah.
was the other king on the other side of town, right?
Yeah, the king was Ishbosheth, the rival king, Saul's son. Saul's son. Now, we don't know that David had a relationship at all with Ishbosheth. He had a relationship with Jonathan. We don't know what he felt about Ishbosheth, but he doesn't seem very happy that these guys killed him. But then again, it's very convenient. It's a very convenient end to Ishbosheth, a very convenient end to the two people that killed Ishbosheth.
What happened to
By the way, I told you, this is very Game of Thrones. I mean, there's nothing in this where you go, oh my gosh, if this was on television, you'd be like sickened by it.
and what happened to the leader where David went and fought with him?
Oh, the Philistines?
Yeah, what happened to him?
Oh, we haven't seen them yet. Don't worry, they'll be back. They'll be back. No, but no, it's an interesting question, because look, he took care of it. Well, you're actually going to see this right now. We're actually going to have a little recounting of David's time. Here we go.
Keep reading, Rose. Good job.
David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years.
Yeah, so let's just say that for a second. So that means that for 7 years, David was not king over all of Israel, in the sense that, well, that's not exactly true. It took him some time to capture Jerusalem, or to take Jerusalem and to make it his capital. But it seems for the most part, for about 7 years, David has a rival king in either Saul or his son Ishbosheth. So during that 7-year period, David considers himself king. And okay, so let's say from the time he left the Philistines, we're not even sure that he's counting from there, by the way. I will tell you this. The important thing is that for almost 10 years, 7 years, 7.5 years, David has a rival throne to King Saul and his family.
Even though that they're dead?
Well, they're not. They're not, I mean, until this point. So the question of how long, it doesn't say, look, the Bible didn't say for 7.5 years, David had a rival throne. It didn't say that. It said that he ruled in Hebron. But he's ruling in Hebron because someone else is ruling somewhere else. He doesn't move to Jerusalem until right about what we're reading, because he moves north to be the king over all Israel. So until this moment where the people of Israel come to him in Hebron and say, you're our king, or not our king, our ruler, our captain, not even our ruler, our leader, he hasn't done this yet. And so what he's going to do now is,
So we will learn who that rival is.
oh, we did. That was Ishbosheth.
I thought he got killed.
He did. So the question is how
No,
much,
I'm
so no, the
confused.
question is how much, no, you're not confused. How much time has elapsed is roughly 7.5 years. Is some of that time right here now, which is right here. Rosemary?
Okay. The king and his men set out for Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the region. David was told, you will never get in here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you black. They meant David will never enter here.
So it's pretty clear that the meaning of it though is he can't capture Jerusalem. Jerusalem is too hard to capture. The people there are going to fight you. It's a very hard city to capture because it's on a hillside, surrounded by valleys. You're not going to be able to get Jerusalem. Now, of course, why does he want Jerusalem? Because it's very hard to capture. And if you have that city, then it's a great capital for you because it's hard to capture for someone else when they want to capture it, right? So let's get into the safest city we can. Saul never captured it. The Jebusites, who are a Canaanite people, they're a Canaanite kingdom, city state, they're living there. The Jebusites are not Israelites. They're not a tribe. They're not us. They're Canaanites. They're living there. And it's a very well fortified city already.
But did they recognize the other king?
Did they? I don't know if they recognized it, but for the last 200 years since Joshua came in with the people, the last 200 years, no one's gotten the Jebusites out of Jerusalem. 200 years later, all the judges, all the leaders, all the Philistines, everybody else around there has never gotten the Jebusites out of Jerusalem. Now here's David. And look, what city you capture, we're watching that happen right now. The defense of Kiev is, that's the biggest thing that anyone's talking about in the last month is whether this city is going to fall. And again, that's not a city that's got the mountains and stuff. It has rivers. It makes it a tough city to capture because of its rivers. But yeah, you capture that city and people basically said that's the end of the war. If Kiev falls, then it's all over for Ukraine. So Jebusites are living there and feeling very secure. So what does David do?
But David captured the stronghold of Zion. It is now the city of David. On that occasion, David said, those who attack the Jebusites shall reach the water channel and strike down the lame and the blind who are hateful to David. That is why they say, no one who is blind or lame may enter the house.
So this is a weird, and again, people are going to say, well, this is not very politically correct. And again, all of this and why it says meaning of Hebrew uncertain is that this definitely seems to be connected with the previous, even the blind and lame will turn you back. This is a play on that same language, which is something to the effect of you're never going to conquer the city. And it's like almost like a reminder that you can't, even the people who are differently able will be able to defeat you. David captures one of the strongholds. He captures Mount Zion. And that's what it's called, Metzudat Zion, the stronghold of Zion, or the fortress, the castle at Zion. That is now, it says, Ir David, the city of David. Now, that's kind of weird because it's basically telling us already what's going to happen in the future, which is that this area, the Zion stronghold, the Zion fortress, is where David was going to make his city. Now, is this different than Jerusalem? So what it seems is the situation, and this is what archaeologists are uncovering right now, because the city of David is a very active archaeological site. They're finding stuff there all the time. It's technically outside of the city wall of Jerusalem. So it's not, wasn't part of the city of Jerusalem. It was a separate stronghold. It was a separate mountain. It was a separate fortress. David or Solomon after him, they make it one city. They create they fill it in and they basically make it one area. But for a good part of the time, it wasn't. So David controls this area, and this is his first part of Jerusalem area that he captures. What's interesting is it also tells us that he made it his part of the city later on. That's where David's own area is going to be of Jerusalem. It's a little foreshadow. I mean, basically gives away the fact that, well, we know he takes Jerusalem, but that part in particular, the first part of Jerusalem he took, was going to be his home. That's where he was going to live. That's dear to him, maybe because it's the first part of Jerusalem he took. What's interesting is that we've excavated this place and we now know a lot about this place. One of the reasons that we do know a lot about this place is because it was never built on like the rest of the city of Jerusalem. It's right across the road from, it's right across the area from it's right across from the area that we now know as the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. It's right near there, but it's not there. And because it's not there, it was kind of left alone a little bit. And it's really been a great place for us to excavate. So the City of David excavations are still going on. They're uncovering lots of information about the First Temple period, about the time of King David. We haven't found the evidence for King David yet, but all the evidence we found so far, well, I should say all the evidence, but a lot of the evidence we found so far actually kind of buttresses this idea that King David made this his special part of his city. So, and the Bible says so, doesn't mean that necessarily archaeology said so, but in this case, so far it's, I mean, there's arguments about it, but so far there's enough on this from the standpoint of the City of David excavations are kind of telling us a lot about it, and because they weren't as built on as the rest of Jerusalem throughout history, because remember, Jerusalem has layers and layers of history. The City of David, because it wasn't built up as much, it's much easier to excavate and get to that layer that is this area from King David's time, from about 3,000 years ago. The other stuff, we just have layers and layers. It's very hard because everything's mixed up. There's so many layers of civilization and habit. It's just very hard to excavate like the old city. Not so the City of David. So it's actually hard to really get to see a lot of it because there's still a lot of excavating going on there in the City of David. So
David occupied the stronghold and renamed it the City of David. David also fortified the surrounding area from the Millo inward. David kept growing stronger, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David with cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Thus, David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingship for the sake of his people, Israel.
okay, so pause right there, because what about the rest of Jerusalem? David makes a palace for himself. He builds a palace, but what about the rest of Jerusalem? Because it says right here, David keeps growing stronger. God is with him. King Hiram of Tyre, Tsur in the Bible, that is Phoenicia. Those are Canaanite peoples too, but they're living in modern day, what we call Lebanon today. They send cedar logs, the cedars of Lebanon, the Arazim. They send carpenters and stonemasons because they're not handy people. That's right. There's not DIY people. No. King Hiram becomes David's builder, his contractor, but he's a king too. but he's just a little bit more into architecture than David is. King Hiram. Very important for those who are steeped in Masonic tradition. Hiram. Yeah, we know about him a little bit from the Bible. And yeah, he becomes part of Masonic lore, as you can see, because he also was in charge of the carpenters and stonemasons. So, but he's not an Israelite, he's a Canaanite. So, but what about the rest of Jerusalem? What about the rest of Jerusalem?
Doesn't say.
Keep going. Yeah, and
After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to David. These are the names of the children born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shavab, Nathan, and Solomon, Ivhar, Elishua, Nepheg, and Yapha, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet.
yeah, so there's more sons for David, more wives, more concubines. It's not a ridiculous amount of children that were born to him.
This is the second go around, right?
Yeah, he already has the children and wives that we read about that were born in Hebron before he was the king of everybody. So these are the other kings. And we read right here that he has a son named Solomon. Not a very descriptive story about Solomon's birth, because that's not the point here. It's all it's telling us is that he had other children born to him in Jerusalem. And these were the ones that were born to him after he's king of everybody. And it included Solomon. Do not worry, we're going to read the story about Solomon coming up. Either again, a different author, a different intention, a different part of the Bible. We're going to read about Solomon's birth. Solomon's parents' love story, the story of David and Bathsheba. So that is coming. We haven't read it. You haven't missed it. It just told us he was born, but we haven't read the story of how he got born. It's a great, wonderful romance. It's a wonderful romance. It's a little crazy too, a little crazy as well. But what it says is that David has other kids. So there's a lot of kids that David has, but it's not ridiculous for a guy who's king and who's, has the ability to have lots of wives and concubines. It's not a crazy amount. It's not like his son Solomon, who we just read about, who has lots more wives and lots more kids, a ridiculous amount of kids, or ridiculous amount of wives, I should say. And the kids kind of were a natural product of that. All right. Now, Marcia asked, what about those pesky, pesky Philistines? Those pesky, pesky Philistines.
When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, the Philistines marched up in search of David. But David heard of it, and he went down to the fastness. The Philistines came and spread out over the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands? And the Lord answered David, go up and I will deliver the Philistines into your hands.
So David wants to make sure that this is a sanctioned battle against the Philistines. So he asks God, can I do this? Are you going to give me permission? So remember, David's life. He killed Goliath, the Philistine hero, who made it. That's how he made his name, by killing a Philistine. Then when Saul is chasing him, he goes to work for the Philistines. And now one of his first battles that he's in Jerusalem and he's king over everybody, because we haven't heard about his battles yet as king over everybody. Look who his first battle that we read about is against the Philistines. So again, it wasn't necessarily his first battle. It says he's growing in power. Maybe there were some other battles before that, but the first one we read about that's like this, pitched battle, a campaign, if you will, Philistines. So Philistines are back in the story.
Thereupon David marched to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me as waters break through a dam. That is why that place was named Baal Perazim.
Yeah, so the word Peretz means a breach. And so the place is called Baal Perazim, the Baal of Peretz, of the breaks, of the breaches. Which is interesting because again, it basically says that there's the little note there, the Baal of breaches. And again, it reminds us of Peretz, one of David's ancestors, Peretz, one of Judah's sons. Judah, who had these sons, Peretz and Zerach, with his daughter-in-law / wife Tamar. And Peretz the name comes back here in the Baal Peretzim, the Baal of the breaches. It's nice that the Bible reminds us, as we've been talking about, there are a lot of connections between Genesis and the story of Samuel. And here's another one.
Once again, the Philistines marched up and spread out.
Oh, wait,
missed a line,
you left
sorry.
the Philistines. Yeah.
Yeah. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off.
Which, by the way, I mean, that's not a good thing. You want to destroy those things. You don't want to carry them off, but whatever. They're idols.
Once again, the Philistines marched up and spread out over the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Do not go up, but circle around behind them and confront them at the Bakah trees."
And if you look at the note here, it says, we're not exactly sure why they're called Bakaim, because it seems like a strange recognition of the kinds of trees that they come to. But here's what it says.
And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the Bakah trees, then go into action, for the Lord will be going in front of you to attack the Philistine forces. David.
Yeah. So again, this is part of the signal that it's time to go. And so there seems to be some kind of either cover that's being provided by the sound of the trees, some type of cover for their attack that's being done by the trees. But the trees are an important part of this story here.
David did as the Lord had commanded him, and he routed the Philistines from Geba all the way to Gezer.
Yeah, and so just to give people a quick mappage of this, some map action here of where we're talking about. It is, let me see if this one's clear. No, that one's a little too small. That one doesn't have Gezer on it. Hold it a second. I'll show you this one. All right, let's show a real quick map up here. Nope. Let me do this one. So here's the map, and what we're talking about here is that he fights them here. He fights them right about here. In this area right around here. I don't see Gibeon is there, but that's not Geba. Geba is closer to over here. And it says he fought him here near Jerusalem, and he defeated them all the way to Gezer, which is here. It's kind of halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The road actually goes by Gezer today. There's a kibbutz there. We actually had the rabbi from Gezer. She came here and spoke to us once. She's one of the few Reform rabbis that's an official rabbi in Israel. Anyways, which shows you how far the Philistines were into the land of Israel. The Philistines are supposed to be down here. They're supposed to be down here in these cities: Ashdod, Gath, Ashkelon, Gaza. They're supposed to be here, but they're up here, which means that they're in the heartland of Israel and Judah, right? Because this is Judah down here, and this is Israel, which means they're all up in here. Philistines are they're controlling Israelite territory, which means that David is king, but he's not king over the land he's supposed to be king over. Not at least all of it, because it shows that the Philistines are inhabiting controlling a good part of Israel at that time, Israel and Judah. All right, let's go back to the text.
David again assembled all the picked men of Israel, 30,000 strong. Then David and all the troops that were with him set out from Baalim of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, to which the name was attached, the name Lord of Hosts enthroned on the cherubim.
Yeah, and by the way, if you look here, it says right here, a note, identical with Baalah, another name for Kiryat Yearim, where the ark had been kept. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, maybe last week, the name Baal is used all over the place. I think we said it last week. Don't think that Baal can't be used. They just used it in the name of two towns that we just read about. So Baal Peratzim and Baalim or Baalah, as this place is called, they don't have any reason not to use the name Baal. It means Lord. It also is the god Baal, but it's not one god. There's a lot of Baals. But the fact that Baal is used sometimes is not the reason why Ishbaal is known as Ishbosheth. He's called Ishbosheth because they want you to know he's a man of shame, not he's a man of Baal. They don't seem to have an issue with it. I mean, it's convenient, definitely convenient that his name is Baal, but again, there's Yerubbaal, who's also known as Gideon. We call him Yerubbaal. Baal Shem Tov. We use the word Baal, it doesn't necessarily mean bad, something bad. But again, this is where the ark was. The ark was not in Jerusalem yet. He brings it up, and he brings it up with the troops. And here's what's going to happen with the ark. We actually just read this Haftarah a couple of weeks ago, just so you know. We read this Haftarah at the end of March. It's the Haftarah that we read with Parshat Shmini, which, to remind those from Leviticus, when we read Shmini, it's the story of Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron who offer up an alien fire and then get burned up. You'll see why we chose this Haftarah to be read at that time. So they're bringing up the ark with all the troops. They're loading it up.
They loaded the ark of God onto a new cart and conveyed it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Abinadab's sons, Uzzah and Ahio, guided the new cart. They conveyed it from Abinadab's house on the hill, Uzzah walking alongside the ark of God, and Ahio walking in front of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel danced before the Lord to the sound of all kinds of cypress wood instruments, with lyres, harps, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals.
Things are going really good. It's a super happy day. We're bringing the ark up to Jerusalem.
They're having a parade.
It's fun. A lot of music, a lot of dancing. It's a lot of fun. David and all the house of Israel are dancing. Even David's dancing.
But when they came to the threshing floor of Nachon, Uzzah reached out for the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. The Lord was incensed at Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for his indiscretion, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was distressed because the Lord had inflicted a breach upon Uzzah, and that place was named Peretz Uzzah, as it is still called.
Wow, the name Peretz came back again. Seems like a pretty important word in this story. Yeah, it's breach. And here it's the breach of Uzzah. It's where Uzzah came up and stopped the ark from falling. Now this is it's a really troubling part of the Bible.
Because he put his hand on it.
This is a guy,
But he's stable.
he was trying, the Bible is very clear and that he was trying to do the right thing.
Because it was almost like a reflex.
Correct. He's stopping the ark. He's stopping the ark from falling. He's only trying to do the right thing,
It's a reward.
and he dies.
He's rewarded by that. He's rewarded for that act of selfless.
See, there's a reason why we read this story when we read the story of Shmini. When Nadav and Avihu get burned up for offering up an alien fire, there's a real question. Is God overreacting a little bit? But of course, there's this issue, which is you can't mess around with divine stuff. Don't touch the ark. Remember, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Don't want to mess around with the ark.
Or look when
It's too powerful. It's way too powerful. So you don't even touch it. So again, you can't mess around. There's no room even for,
think God would have stopped it from falling to the ground.
Well, that's not-
And then someone would have had to pick it up.
okay, clearly the guy dies miraculously. It freaks everybody out. Freaks everyone out. And he dies. It's clearly God did it because guy was healthy. He reaches out, touches it, and then he dies. So it's clearly an act of God. Bible is pretty clear on it. David's freaked out. It says right there, David was distressed. Everyone is a little concerned with what just happened. Listen, the place ends up getting a new name where that happened. It's called Peretz Uzzah from now on. Like there's a place, we call it that. So every time you walk by it, you think about that.
And do we know what's in this?
Ten Commandments.
Still, yeah.
Still carrying?
But it's got the Kruvim. It says right there, the Kruvim is on, the angels are on top of it. It's God's holy ark. So what would have happened otherwise? That's the question you ask. It's a normal question that people ask. What would have happened if Uzzah doesn't do this act of kindness, a response of protection? What would have happened?
Somebody else would have done it, and he would have died.
Look, it's a problem. Look, the reason that Ronnie said what he did is because there are people who say that, no, this was God rewarded him with a painless death at that point. Who knows? I mean, look, there's a problem because people, they have a problem with the consequences of this.
Well, maybe it's because if he hadn't done it, David would have done it and that didn't happen.
We listen. Everybody throughout the generations has had an issue with this story. Did this have to happen? What would have happened otherwise? Would the ark have floated in space? I mean, look, we don't know. The point is that Uzzah doesn't let that happen. And in a moment, and you said it's an instinct, right? His instinct was to do this. His instinct took over and he did it. The problem is that the Bible is essentially telling us here, sometimes you have to override your instincts. You have to let this play out. Now, what would have happened? Now, what the Bible is kind of telling us here, the way I read it, is that there's an interesting lesson about not letting your instincts, not going with your instincts, because your instincts are to save the ark. The problem is, if Uzzah can touch the ark in this moment and get away with it, who's to say someone else can't say, well, I got to touch the ark? I have to. It's the only way for blank to happen. Let me just see. It's from Aminadab's house, but
I mean, why would anybody but Levites be even near the ark at this point?
well, it's very important in that he look, it's on the cart. They're kind of accompanying it because it was in their house. It'd been in their house.
But they're out in public, so people are going to be out, right?
Well, it gets weirder than that. We haven't finished the story yet, but yeah, I mean, Ronnie's question is, why is anyone except a priest or a Levite even coming near it, right? David is definitely taking control of it, if you will, right? In the sense that he's bringing it up, he's dancing with it, he's playing instruments. So we assume some of maybe the musicians are Levites, maybe they're not. It doesn't say. It's supposed to be Levites are supposed to be the musicians for the ark. We don't know, but it definitely seems a little bit of a free-for-all. But it does get back to this point I'm saying, is that if people can say, well, I had to do it, I had to touch the ark, then it always becomes an ends justify the means argument, which is I had to. And it's almost as if they're saying you can't use that argument when it comes to God and when it comes to the ark. You can't say, but I had to. I had to. You can't say that, because that's not for you and I to decide. That's not for a human being to decide. Well, but I had to. And that's almost what they're saying, is that you can't, when it comes to the commandments that deal with God and God's stuff here, you and I we have to follow the rules, which is why the Haftarah for Nadav and Avihu is what that's why we read these stories together. Because, there's a real question. Did Nadav and Avihu really do a really bad thing? They offer up an alien fire. So that's all it says. And then they get burned up. Aaron's own sons got burned up the first day in public that they're offering up, the opening day of the ark, of the tabernacle, the opening day of the temple in the desert. They get burned up. It's a terrible story. And so we're left with a reinforcement of this idea, at least by the people who picked that as a haftarah. Yeah, you don't mess around with stuff with God's stuff. We don't make decisions based on our own necessity, even our own instinct, even our own judgment. We had to do it. We had to do it for the ark. Nope. It's not done yet. It's not done.
David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can I let the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David would not bring the ark of the Lord to his place in the city of David. Instead, David diverted it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his whole household. It was reported to King David, "The Lord has blessed Obed-Edom's house and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." Thereupon, David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David amid rejoicing.
So stop right there. So I think the story pretty much tells us that David was freaked out. David was scared. He didn't want anything to do with the ark after that. Whoa, it's like, this is way too powerful for me. I don't want it here. Maybe I made a mistake. And so he leaves it there. He literally leaves it there. Don't bring it all the way up. He leaves it in a person's home named Obed-Edom, which again, it says he's a Gittite, which is a Philistine. And his name is Obed-Edom, which means a servant of the Edomites. I mean, the whole name, the whole thing is weird, because this is not like a guy you'd think good things would happen to him, because he's not even it doesn't even appear that he's an Israelite. I mean, by the way, could have been. The rabbis don't like the idea that he's not an Israelite. They won't take that at all. Just happened to be he was from, Gath. Just so happens that his name is Obed-Edom. Doesn't mean that he's not an Israelite, but it doesn't matter. David hears, oh, the ark is not a curse. It's not a problem. On the contrary, Obed-Edom has gotten a whole lot of luck. He keeps winning at the horse races now that he's got the ark. Good things are happening. He's getting real successful with the ark there in his house. He's got the ultimate magic 8-ball, picking all the stocks. Everything's good with Obed-Edom. And so David says, okay, I can bring it in. I'm going to bring it into the city of David. That means God isn't really upset. And he brings it in rejoicing. So now we're going to read what happened when David brings in the ark into his own hometown, into his own quarter, if you will, into the city of David. Remember again, at least what we've read so far, doesn't seem like all of Jerusalem is under David's control. The city of David is under David's control, but not necessarily all the rest of Jerusalem yet at this point. It says it again, the city of David, Ir David. Again, the rabbis would like us to know that Jerusalem is called Ir David. And so they don't make any distinction between Ir David and the rest of Jerusalem. I will tell you, based on the archaeology, based on the Bible itself, it does not say Jerusalem. It says Ir David, the city of David. It does not appear that all of Jerusalem is under David's control when he brings the ark in. Even at this point, Jerusalem is not under David's control. But he's bringing in the ark. And this is one of the greatest scenes to me. This is one of my favorite scenes in the entire Bible ever, in any place, at any time, anywhere. This is one of my favorite scenes in the whole Bible. And it is one of the most humanly, like it brings to life. And as you're going to see, the emotions, you have to imagine it. You have to imagine these people in your head as you're reading the story. You cannot let this moment go by without envisioning these people in your mind. So here's David dancing, singing, rejoicing as the ark comes into Jerusalem, or at least into his part of Jerusalem, the city of David.
When the bearers of the ark of the Lord had moved forward 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David whirled with all his might before the Lord. David was girt with a linen ephod. Thus David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with blasts of the horn.
So it's an amazing scene. Every 6 feet that he goes, or every 6 paces, every 6 steps that he takes, he's sacrificing another animal, another ox, and another cow. I mean, this is an amazing, like,
It doesn't talk about the priests doing it, does it?
well, it's even more than that. According to the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls, it's 7 ox and 7 rams. And also in the book of Chronicles. So even in the Bible, other places in the Bible, it says he's sacrificing 7. Yeah, so were there sacrifices being done by the priests? We're not sure. The point is that this is just an amazing scene. And David is dancing around in his underwear. That's what it just said. He's wearing a linen ephod. He's wearing linen breeches. That's what he's wearing. That's all. That's all he's wearing.
As the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him for it.
Yeah, let's pause right there. So that's the ultimate side glance that you call it, that her stink eye that she gives him as she looks down on him. And it says she looks out of the window. So she's up in the house, the 2nd floor, whatever, watching this go down. And she looks at him, watches him dancing around, leaping around, and she looks at him like, what a fool. She hates him. So she hates him. So this is a woman who we read loved him. It's not like she started out hating him. It's not like this was a forced marriage that she never enjoyed. But at this point, right here, what we just read, she hates him. She hates him in her heart. Despises him in her heart. This is a woman who went from loving him to, at this point, hating him. Now, it's not because he's dancing in his underwear. She was married to another guy, Paltiel. We don't know what Michal felt like when her husband Paltiel was taken away from her. We don't know what her reaction is at that moment. But we do know here, she hates David. Now, again, she sees him dancing. She sees him celebrating. She's had her husband, her second husband, taken away from her. She's been married off to this guy, back to David, has to live with him, has to see him having children with a bunch of other people. He's got other wives. She's the princess. Her father was king, and yet he's now having children with all these other ladies. All of these things are going on in her head. But she looks at him out of the window and hates him. So picture that. Picture Michal in your mind for a second, looking down at King David, dancing around in his underwear. all the people making noise and all the sacrifices and all the music and the timbrels and people jump, not just David, but everyone's jumping around and dancing, celebrating. And she's looking down at the king, her husband, and she hates him.
They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it up in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem that the priests are doing a lot of the work here. So were they doing a lot of the work? Look, the rabbis want you to know that he doesn't do this himself. Every time it says that he's having sacrifices being made, that he's doing these things, that there's priests doing it for him. They don't like the idea that David would have done this without rabbinic authority, priestly authority. They don't like that idea. They don't like envisioning that. They don't envision that. Bible doesn't say anything about priests here. It could be. Doesn't say there were no priests there. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say David didn't let the priests come up, didn't let the Levites come up, didn't let the Kohanim. It doesn't say that, but also doesn't say they're there. It doesn't mention them one time. And it says that he blessed the people. That's the job of the Kohanim. That's what the Kohanim are supposed to do. It doesn't say he had them bless them. And I think at that point, you're actually kind of giving it away, which is that David is doing stuff that the priests are supposed to be doing. At least when he's blessing them. Does not seem to be something that the king is supposed to do, but he's filled with this, energy. He's filled with this, this celebration, this divine energy that he's celebrating with. It's a great scene. You can go back and watch the Richard Gere scene of him dancing around in his underwear. It's about a 35-year-old Richard Gere. It's not a 65, 70-year-old Richard Gere dance. This movie, okay, fine, but in 1980, whatever, when the movie was made, it was about that level of Richard Gere dancing. It was more American Gigolo Richard Gere than Richard Gere of today's time, which you don't even see Richard Gere very much today anymore. But this is a David who is very, very ecstatic and is filled with joy and is filled with celebration, dancing. And he's blessing the people too, which is wonderful. I mean, I think it's wonderful. Priests might not have thought it was wonderful. Other people might have said this is him getting out of his wheelhouse, right? Yeah. This is not David doing what he is supposed to necessarily be doing as king, but he's so excited. He's so happy. It's such a celebration. And again, he's now affirming himself as the king of Israel by bringing the ark up into his city, making it his capital, making it the religious capital for the people. And here's it says what happens here.
And he
Amazing story.
distributed among all the people, the entire multitude of Israel, man and woman alike, to each a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, and a raisin cake. Then all the people left for their homes.
Okay, so let's before we read verse 20. So he's given everybody food, and this is not the first time we've heard about these raisin cakes. These raisin cakes must have been something really delicious because they're, it's not just bread. They get a raisin cake. To me, yeah, it doesn't sound so great, but
Raisin bread.
maybe.
That's cool.
To me, it sounds more like, the equivalent today of giving somebody a nice slice of cheesecake. But back in those days, it was raisin. Back then, it was raisin cake. That was what we ate for celebrations back 3,000 years ago, as our taste buds and as our diets changed a little bit, maybe. But this is a celebration. This is celebration food.
Well, a
This is
raisin
party
cake
food.
will keep, a cheesecake.
No,
no,
I
it's too
know.
much.
There's no question. Listen, there's no question. We didn't start eating cheesecakes until a couple hundred years ago. I'm not going to tell you that's Ashkenazi food. But raisin cake was what they liked. They liked raisin cake. And so this was something really special. This was something that the people, we read about Abigail making raisin cakes for them. So this was a delicacy. This was something very special. They didn't just get bread, they got cakes, and they got, it was a celebration for everybody. Everybody's happy. Everyone's getting food. Well, let's read what happens to Michal.
Blew it up.
Here's what.
David
says.
went home to greet his household. And Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "Didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself today in the sight of the slave girls of his subjects, as one of the riffraff might expose himself?" David answered Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family, and appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will dance before the Lord and dishonor myself even more, and be low in my own esteem. But among the slave girls that you speak of, I will be honored."
Okay, let's pause right there. So one of the greatest scenes, that's why I said it's one of the greatest scenes in the entire Bible. It's one of the greatest scenes in the entire Bible. To me, that confrontation between the husband and wife who once loved each other, she risked her life to save him from her own father. When when Saul was trying to kill David, remember, she pretended that, he was lying in bed, right? And put out the mannequin and the idol in the bed so that he could get out. Listen, whatever happened, she loved him at one point, risked her life for him, and now she hates him. And now everything he does disgusts her.
Why does she hate him so much?
Well, he took away her husband, the second husband, the one that seemed, well, we don't know how. Seems like Paltiel was a good guy. He was crying when he was taken away from her. We don't read what she says or what she does, but that's one good reason. And of course, her family is out of power.
And most of them have been killed.
Most of them, yes.
Most of them have been killed.
Thanks for the update.
They're dead. And now he's sleeping with anyone he wants. And she says that to him. You're out there dancing with slave girls. So it's not even princesses or even wealthy people that you're dancing and carousing with. You're carousing with anybody, with riffraff. And she looks down on him as a princess. She looks down on him and says, you have no shame. And he says, yeah, you're right. I have no shame. I'm going to go crazy. And you think that's bad? He goes, I'm going to make myself sick. He says, that's the kind of the translation. I will be low in my own esteem. You think that's bad? I'm going to get even worse.
Wouldn't she be queen? Is it a princess?
Well, she was, but she was a princess too. Before she was queen, she was princess.
I understand.
She was Saul's daughter and therefore the princess. And she was the only woman maybe in that whole kingdom. And the only person except maybe her own other sister, Merav, was any claim of being worthy of being the queen.
She's not the queen with
Once he's married.
Once he's married to other women, there's other women that he's married to. You're going to get to the next line, the last line, which is the important line. But well, it's all important, but the kicker. But at this point, David says, you ain't seen nothing yet. You think that was bad? I'm going to do even more. I'm going out later and it's going to get even nastier. That's what he says to her. Those slave girls you speak of, oh, they're going to be honored tonight. That's what he says to her. This is a scene that literally blows your mind when you think about what happens in it. The animosity, the hatred, this love that's turned to hate. It's one of the most powerful confrontations in the entire Bible. And it's between a husband and a wife. It's between a king and a queen. It's between two families that were rivals. And to me, it's some of the best dialogue that I've ever heard in any movie, in any book, in any place I've ever read. And it probably really happened. If it didn't happen, somebody had an exceptionally creative mind that even if it was embellished, I don't care. It's just amazing. This power of this emotion.
You like this interaction.
I will tell you, it blows my mind because I've seen people interact like this. I've seen people who loved each other, get so mad at each other that they say the most hurtful, hateful things they can say. And David's, they cut each other and they go right after each other. David says to her, I'm the one who got chosen. Your family, they're done. God turned on them. God chose me and not your family. He doesn't stop.
Is that why they don't have children?
Well, we haven't gotten to that. That's the next line. That's the next line. Okay,
Just
so
wait.
since you want that line, here's the line. Read it, Rosemary.
So to her dying day, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children.
And that's the end of the chapter, folks. That's the last line. That's the kicker. They never had a child. They never had a child.
Does that mean that they kind of live separate lives at that point?
Doesn't seem like there's a lot of love. So either they never slept together again, which is a possibility. She didn't want to sleep with him. He didn't want to sleep with her, whatever happened. But understand that there's an implication here, which is that the king who could have been born to them, that could have unified the tribes, that unified the country, never was born.
Solve it and make sure that didn't happen. David makes sure that didn't happen.
Well, she made sure it didn't happen. It doesn't say. It says to her dying day, she had no children. That's what the words say. So did she never let him come near her? Did he never want to come near her? All we know is this: the king that could have unified the kingdom, I'll say it again, never was born. And just so you understand, Solomon, the one who does become king, the great King Solomon, the one who builds the temple and who does all the great things that we know of, great King Solomon, who rules for a really long time and has great peace and brings great wealth to the kingdom, according to the Bible. He doesn't unify the people. As a matter of fact, by the time he dies, the north has already rebelled against him and has already broken away. In his own lifetime, there is no unified kingdom of Israel beyond this 40 years or so that King David is there, and then whatever time Solomon was king before the people started rebelling and moving away. But maybe for 60 years, 55, 60 years, the kingdom was ever unified. There was no unified kingdom of Israel beyond a lifetime. A person could have lived and died in Israel and lived during one civil war, the civil war between David and Saul, and then the civil war between Solomon and Jeroboam. There are people who lived and saw both of those things in their lifetimes. There was never enough time for this kingdom ever to be unified. And who knows what would have happened otherwise. So the Bible leaves us with this really weird unanswered question. What could have happened if David and Michal could have loved each other, would have not been separated, would have not gone through this? So there's a very weird question it's there in the back of our minds, which is, how did human emotions, how did love, how did a relationship destroy the possibilities for a kingdom that never happened, a kingdom of Jews that would have had a northern and southern unified kingdom?
Did David go ego crazy at this point? I mean, he seemed to be such a humble man up to this point, and then he's like, all this power, and I'm gonna do this.
Let's put it this way. David is not done riding the roller coaster of humility and arrogance. The amazing thing about him is that he never stops
Isn't that the thing that
to his dying day. And that's why David is such an amazing person.
But isn't that what finally put, and I'm bad with names, Saul away? I mean, the one that died early on that didn't
Well,
follow God's rules.
Saul seems to have had other demons, to put it mildly, that he seems to have had mental illness, right? He seems to have had problems in his mind,
Okay.
right? David's problems are much more human.
Yeah.
They're much more complex,
But that's not
which is that David is so human. But the amazing thing about it is he admits his humanity. He actually humbles himself several times. So when you ask the question, is this where he launches off into ego? Maybe, but it's not always going to be that way. He's not always going to have that ego. And so because of that, because you can see his humanity throughout the Bible and throughout the rest of this book, you're not left with an easy answer. There's not an easy answer on this of what David did was bad or good. That's the problem is everyone wants to simplify David. In our tradition, the rabbis want to make David a perfect guy, and he clearly is not. And the problem is that David, by his own admission, is not a perfect guy. He lays it all out. He could have not had it laid out. His editors, his scribes, his people could have excised this stuff, and yet they didn't. They definitely did some reworking of things. There's no question that David does certain things to make sure he doesn't look like he killed Saul and his family. He wants to make sure that David is nowhere near the battle when the Philistines killed Saul. He's nowhere near that battle. He's nowhere near Mephibosheth when he becomes lame. He's not responsible for any of that kind of stuff. So the Bible clearly was written with David's seal on it. But he also made sure that this conversation was allowed to be there. He allowed that conversation to be recounted.
Rabbi,
This said that. When you read the story of the patriarchs, the rabbis do exactly the same thing. The patriarchs are very damaged people in a lot of ways. I mean, Abraham.
Every one of
I
them.
mean, each one of them did something that we consider awful, just like David.
Or dysfunctional. Yeah. And David is not done. I'm just going to tell you, you've only seen part of David so far. You've seen David as a 30-year-old guy. You have not seen him as a father yet. You've not seen him as a king who is trying to figure out how to pass on his throne. There's a lot more David coming. But this David right here at this point, where he's having this confrontation, you're not really, I mean, he just told you that he let his emotions, you got to judge him for what he says. And he says, look, I said at that moment, I said, I'm not done. So his wife confronting him and telling him he's made a fool of himself, he doesn't say, you're right. I probably went a little too far. He doesn't leave it at that because he says, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm going out later. I'm going to dishonor myself even more. I'm going to lose control. He says that I'm going to go crazy. He says, if I'm low in your esteem, whatever, believe me, I'm okay with that, is what he says. And
Rabbi,
yeah.
I know we've talked about then and always we can bring it back to now. And now this is probably the biggest problem I'm having dealing with life issues, is trying to understand the selfish side of people who are just saying, I'm going to do this and I don't really care how it impacts you. That so much feels like what you're reading here. And it scares me. It scares me to see that people can have it. He's so full of himself, but I feel today that's what's happening. And there are so many other people that are very humble or sitting back and going, oh my God, why is this happening? Right.
So it's a cautionary tale.
But it's
for-
great. I mean,
But David had no issue making sure that people knew,
but I find a
learn
lot
from
of
my
people
story.
today have no issue either.
What I like about it in that sense is that it's reassuring
Yeah, you're
in
right.
some ways, that it's human nature and yeah, it's wrong and yeah, it's all that other stuff, but it is human nature, because look, even our King David
That's true.
did this.
I feel like I'm in a ping pong game right now. Okay. I hear this story, then I hear this story, then I take this, then I do this. I mean, I'm totally confused.
Well, the most important thing is don't be confused, because while there's a lot of stuff going on, the takeaway from it is that even these, and again, this is why I don't like the way that people read this, is that David's a perfect guy, is that there is a level of humanity to this great hero of ours that is, it's so wrong to try to rewrite that or try to diminish that, because that's the power of this story. Is, as Judith said, there's comfort in the knowledge that people can make mistakes like this. Now, here's the interesting question that I want to pose to you. So Michal, look, today we might consider Michal in a different light because we live in a more sensitive time where we do want to take into consideration what the woman would have felt. Right? So that might not have always been the case. Right? So Michal might have been considered to be a problem. Right?
They might have thought of this as a cautionary tale about, don't chew out your husband.
So what do you think the rabbis thought about Michal? What do you think the rabbis 2,000 years ago thought about Michal, or even today in traditional Judaism? What do you think? Michal, hero or problem? Heroine or problem? Mouse off to her husband.
Right.
What else? Anybody else?
I still see it as strength, though. I mean, Esther has the same sort of strength, right?
Yeah, well, speaking truth to power.
Children in the Bible.
Well, if you put it, I mean, if you really look at it back
The easy answer
then,
is
even
that there's the answer. She doesn't have kids. I will tell you this. The rabbis 2,000 years ago cut Michal a whole lot of slack. And they actually praised Michal, interestingly, not for necessarily the reasons that you think, but they say something very interesting about Michal, which is that Michal has something working in her mind that is commendable, which is that she has an exceptional ability to understand when things are appropriate and when things are not appropriate. And when she calls out her husband for doing stuff that was inappropriate, she was definitely well within her bounds of saying that.
that actually surprises me, Rabbi.
Naked, almost naked, in front of everybody. So she was right in confronting her husband with this, because in her house, in her ways, and to her credit, she believed that people should have more modesty. It's a Jewish value that we call tznius, or tzniut in Hebrew, tznius in Ashkenazi or Yiddish, to have the proper level of tznius. And so Michal is held up as the paragon of the virtue of modesty. If you think that this is not important, you have not looked at the way people who are more religious dress, right? So covering up your legs with a dress, covering up your arms and your sleeves with longer sleeves. These are all important issues today for those in our community who believe that modesty is important. It's why you can't wear certain clothes at an Orthodox school, right? So tznius is something that we value. Michal values it. She tells her husband, essentially, you're dancing, in an inappropriate way. And so, interesting, the rabbis comment on Michal that she learned this value from her father, King Saul, who also dressed in a modest way, and he would never have done something like this. And he dressed in a way that a king should dress.
The world was surely blind. David's never been modest.
Well,
I mean,
we-
even at the beginning, when she loves him, I mean, he was a little flamboyant.
okay, well, maybe we don't know what David was wearing, but we do know.
His attitude.
Okay, so he might have been more flamboyant. Correct. We don't know. He could have been wearing shepherd's clothes, but the point is that not Michal and not Saul. They were known, and the rabbis imagined that King Saul dressed the part of a king, that David, at least in this scene, definitely doesn't dress the part of, but that maybe David didn't dress appropriately other times as well, that maybe David was more flamboyant or more casual or more inappropriately dressed, doesn't cover himself enough.
Despite all of that, Saul was not successful as a king, and David was, even with dressing immodestly and doing
Yes.
crazy things. And the second thing that I wanted to say is, compare this with Christianity. They made their quote king unquote into God, whereas all of our heroes are very human people with human flaws.
Yeah.
I think that's a big
It is.
downs throughout every
Jesus has a
aspect of
flaw.
our
He
religion.
has flaws.
No, he doesn't. not to Christians, not in the Christian reading of the Bible.
When you read the Christian Bible.
When you read the Christian Bible,
Okay.
when you read the Christian Bible,
Fair enough.
you read it from with Jewish eyes, and we do. It's impossible for us to read the Gospels without saying, "Oh, that seems like Jesus is not quite God in that
I think
answer."
there are a lot of Christians who have problems with cursing the fig tree.
Yes. So if we look at though the way Jesus is portrayed, it's not with this.
Not
And
with
King
this-
David is problematic to everybody to some extent. It's just a question of how you read it. And if you read it that he's doing God's work, then you can kind of work around some of the things that he does, including killing people that he shouldn't kill. But at this point, what we also take away from our understanding of David is that, and Michal, is that there is no way for these people to ever come together. They have different values. They have different ways of living their lives. They're bound to be apart for the rest of their lives now. Wait, somebody said about Esther. Who was the person who said about Esther? Marcia, you said something about Esther. So interestingly, as Marcia just said, there seems to be a little reminiscence of Esther, or what foreshadowing really for Esther, because Esther comes many generations later. And the rabbis actually say that exact thing. Who is Michal's descendant? Esther. She's from the tribe of Benjamin. And she's
But she
very
can't
much
have a
like
descendant.
what?
She can't have a
She does.
descendant.
She's a descendant of Benjamin, right? She's a great aunt. She's a great aunt, but she's one of her family, right? She's not a direct line, but she's from the tribe of Benjamin, and she is, according to the rabbis, a Benjaminite in the like her ancestor Rachel, and like her ancestor now Michal, who shows her modesty and who has this level of, even with the king, I'm going to be modest. Now, of course, the interesting thing about Esther is it seems like, what are you talking about? She was kept in a harem. The rabbis want to tell you that every opportunity that Esther had, she dressed modestly. She never dressed like the women in the harem. And so it was very important for her to actually be like Michal, for her to be modest and to have all levels of modesty. And what's interesting about Queen Esther, she never has a kid that we know of. It doesn't mean that she didn't. We don't know. And Bible doesn't say what happens to Esther and Ahasuerus. But there's this interesting understanding that the rabbis have with Esther and Ahasuerus, this pagan king. He didn't sleep with her. He couldn't sleep with her because she was too modest. So the level of modesty that Esther takes is even crazier, because she willingly and could have slept with King Ahasuerus, but she doesn't. And so this issue of modesty and the family of the Benjaminites is an interesting theme. It's one that, again, the rabbis pick up, but you might not have thought. But Michal is seen as a heroine in her own way. So again, could she have had kids with David? Maybe, but she doesn't.
Was there a husband before David?
Paltiel, there's a husband in
In
between.
between.
In between.
So she never had children with them either.
That's what it says. It doesn't say she didn't have sons or didn't have children with
David.
children, not sons. It says no children, no daughters either. Had no children at all. It says not at all, not with Paltiel, not with David, not with anybody. She had no children. And that, my friends, is the last mention of Michal. Michal is not mentioned again. There are no more conversations. Michal doesn't pop up later on in the story to say, I told you so, or look at your family, David. They're all dysfunctional. Glad I didn't have any kids with you. She might have wanted to say it. Maybe she said it every day. What? Yeah, well, this isn't adultery. This isn't adultery yet. But folks, I will tell you that this is one of, as I said, this is one of my favorite scenes in all the Bible. This is one where you walk away going, the Bible is much more complex. It's much more human. It's much more real than you ever thought.
It's much more fun when we have Rosemary
Well, it's, yes, but it's, but I want everybody, but I want everybody's mind to be blown by how real the Bible is. Because nothing is, nothing to me is better literature, better drama, better soap opera, better. You can't put anything to me against what we just read. I don't care what show it is. And I love a good drama. I love good shit. I love myself some good Shakespeare, but there's nothing like this. This, I'm telling you, is real. And I really do think it, I really in my heart believe it really happened. I don't believe you can make this up. I don't believe you can make it up. All right, everybody, we will see you maybe Wednesday night for class, or we will see you at Pesach. No, the Nathans are saying goodbye. All right, everybody, say goodbye to the Nathans. Say goodbye to all. We say goodbye to all of you. We wish you would. We wish you. Wish you were not going, but going back to the lake. All right, everybody. Chag Sameach. Happy Passover too. Chag Sameach, everyone.
Happy
Bye-bye.
Passover.
That was great.